Chapter 4. First Impressions. The last roll call began. After this call over, the prison wards are locked up, each with its own lock, and the convicts remain shut up till daybreak. The roll was called by a sergeant and 2 soldiers. For this purpose the convicts were sometimes drawn up in ranks in the yard, and the officer on duty was present. But more frequently the ceremony was conducted in a more homely fashion. The roll was called indoors. This is how it was on that occasion. The men on duty made many mistakes, were wrong in their reckoning, went away and came back again. At last the poor fellows brought their sum out right and locked our prison room. In it there were as many as 30 convicts, rather closely packed on the bed. It was too early to go to sleep. Obviously, everyone needed something to do. The only representative of authority in the room was the veteran soldier whom I have mentioned already. There was also in each room a head convict who was appointed by the major himself, on the grounds of good behavior, of course. It often happened that these head convicts were involved in some serious mischief. Then they were flogged, at once degraded and replaced by others. In our room the head convict was Akim Akimich, who, to my surprise, not infrequently shouted at other convicts. They usually responded with jeers. The veteran was wiser. He never interfered in any way, and if he ever did open his lips, it was no more than a matter of form to satisfy his conscience. He sat in silence on his bedstead sewing a boot. The convicts took hardly any notice of him. On that first day of my prison life, I made one observation, and found as time went on that it was correct. All who are not convicts, whoever they are, from those who have the most contact with them, such as guards, soldiers on duty, down to all who have ever had any connection with prison life, have an exaggerated idea of convicts. It is as though they were every minute in uneasy expectation of the convicts suddenly flying at them with a knife. But what is most remarkable, the convicts were themselves aware that they were feared, and it gave them a certain conceit. And yet the very best man to look after convicts is one who is not afraid of them. And indeed, in spite of his conceit, the convict likes it much better when one trusts him. One may even win his affection by doing so. It happened, though very rarely during my life in prison, that some superior officer came into the prison without a guard. It was worth seeing how it impressed the convicts, and impressed them in the most favorable way. Such a fearless visitor always aroused their respect, and if any harm had been possible, it would not have been so in his presence. The dread inspired by convicts is found everywhere where there are prisoners, and I really do not know to what exactly it is due. It has, of course, some foundation, even in the external appearance of the convict, who is, after all, an acknowledged malefactor. Besides, everyone who comes near the prison feels that all this mass of people has been brought together not of their own will, and that, whatever measures are taken, a live man cannot be made into a corpse. He will remain with his feelings, his thirst for revenge and life, his passions and the craving to satisfy them. At the same time, I am convinced that there is no need to fear convicts. A man does not so quickly or so easily fly at another with a knife. In fact, if there may be danger, if there is sometimes trouble, the rarity of such instances shows how trifling the risk is. I am speaking, of course, only of convicted prisoners, many of whom are glad to have reached the prison at last. A new life is sometimes such a good thing, and are consequently disposed to live quietly and peaceably. Moreover, the others will not let those who are really troublesome do mischief. Every convict, however bold and insolent he may be, is afraid of everything in prison. But a convict awaiting punishment is a different matter. He is certainly capable of falling on any outsider apropos of nothing, simply because he will have to face a flogging next day, and if he does anything to bring about another trial, his punishment will be delayed. Here there is an object, a motive for the attack. It is to change his luck at any cost and as quickly as possible. I know one strange psychological instance of the kind. In the military division in our prison there was a convict who had been a soldier, and had been sentenced for 2 years without deprivation of rights. An awful braggart and a conspicuous coward. As a rule, boastfulness and cowardice are rarely found in a Russian soldier. Our soldiers always seem so busy that if they wanted to show off, they would not have time. But if one is a braggart, he is almost always an idler and a coward. Dutov, that was the convict's name, served out his sentence at last and returned to his line regiment. But as all, like him, sent to prison for correction are finally corrupted there, it usually happens that after they have been not more than 2 or 3 weeks in freedom, they are arrested again and come back to the prison, this time not for 2 or 3 years, but as a lifer for 15 or 20 years. And so it happened with him. 3 weeks after leaving the prison, Dutov stole something, breaking a lock to do so, and was insolent and unruly as well. He was tried and sentenced to a severe punishment. Reduced to the utmost terror by the punishment awaiting him, being a most pitiful coward, he fell knife in hand upon an officer who went into the convict's room the day before he would have had to walk the Green Street. Of course he was well aware that by such an act he greatly increased his sentence and his term of penal servitude. But all he was reckoning on was putting off the terrible moment of punishment for a few days, even for a few hours. He was such a coward that he did not even wound the officer, but only attacked him as a matter of form, that there might appear to be a new crime for which he would be tried again. The minute before punishment is certainly terrible for the condemned man, and in the course of several years it was my lot to see a good number of men on the eve of this fatal day. I usually came across these condemned prisoners in the convict ward of the hospital when I lay there ill, which happened pretty often. It is well known to all the convicts throughout Russia that the people most compassionate to them are doctors. They never make any distinction between convicts and other people, as almost all outsiders do, except perhaps the peasants. The latter never reproach the convict with his crime, however terrible it may have been, and forgive him everything on account of the punishment he has endured and his general misery. Significantly, the peasants all over Russia speak of crime as a misfortune, and of criminals as the unfortunate. It is a definition of deep import, and it is the more significant because it is unconscious, instinctive. The doctors are truly a refuge for the convicts in many cases, especially for those awaiting punishment, who are kept far more severely than the ordinary prisoners. The convict awaiting punishment, who has reckoned the probable date of the awful ordeal, often gets into hospital, trying to ward off the terrible moment, even by a little. When he is taking his discharge from the hospital, knowing almost for certain that the fatal hour will be next day, he is nearly always in a state of violent agitation. Some try from vanity to conceal their feelings, but their awkward show of swagger does not deceive their companions. Everyone understands how it is, but is silent from humane feeling. I knew a convict, a young man who had been a soldier, condemned for murder to the maximum number of strokes. He was so panic-stricken that on the eve of the punishment he drank off a jug of vodka in which he had previously soaked snuff. Vodka, by the way, is always taken just before the flogging. It is smuggled in long before the day, and a high price is paid for it. The convict would rather go without every necessity for 6 months than fail to have the money for a bottle of vodka to be drunk a quarter of an hour before the flogging. There is a general belief among the convicts that a drunken man feels the lash or the sticks less acutely. But I am wandering from my story. The poor fellow, after drinking his jug of vodka, was at once taken ill in earnest. He began vomiting blood, and he was carried to the hospital almost unconscious. The vomiting so affected his chest that in a few days he showed unmistakable signs of consumption, of which he died 6 months later. The doctors who treated him for tuberculosis did not know how it had been caused. But speaking of the cowardice so often found in the convict before punishment, I ought to add that some, on the contrary, astonish the observer by their extraordinary fearlessness. I remember some examples of courage which approached insensibility, and such examples were not so very rare. I particularly remember my meeting with a terrible criminal. One summer day a rumor spread in the hospital wards that a famous robber, a runaway soldier called Orlov, would be punished that evening, and would be afterwards brought to the ward. While the convict patients were expecting Orlov to be brought in, they asserted that he would be punished cruelly. They were all in some excitement, and I must confess that I, too, awaited the famous robber's arrival with extreme curiosity. I had heard marvelous stories about him long before. He was a criminal such as there are few, who had murdered old people and children in cold blood. A man of a terrible strength of will and proud consciousness of his strength. He had confessed to many murders, and was sentenced to be beaten with sticks. It was evening before he was brought. It was dark, and the candles had been lighted in the ward. Orlov was almost unconscious, horribly pale, with thick, disheveled, pitch-black hair. His back was swollen and red and blue. The convicts were waiting on him all night, constantly bringing him water, turning him over, giving him medicines, as though they were looking after a brother or a benefactor. Next day he regained consciousness completely and walked twice up and down the ward. It amazed me. He had come into the hospital so very weak and exhausted. He had received at one time half of the whole number of blows to which he was sentenced. The doctor had only stopped the punishment when he saw that its continuance would inevitably cause his death. Moreover, Orlov was small and weakly built and exhausted by long imprisonment before his trial. Anyone who has met prisoners awaiting their trial probably remembers long after their thin, pale, worn-out faces, their feverish looks. But in spite of that, Orlov was recovering quickly. Evidently the energy of his spirit assisted nature. He was certainly not an ordinary man. I was moved by curiosity to make a closer acquaintance with him, and for a week I studied him. I can confidently say that I have never in my life met a man of such strength, of so iron a will as he. I had already seen at Tobolsk a celebrity of the same kind, formerly a brigand chief. He was a wild beast in the fullest sense of the word, and when you stood near him you felt instinctively that there was a terrible creature beside you, even before you knew his name. But in that case what horrified me was the spiritual deadness of the man. The flesh had so completely got the upper hand of all spiritual characteristics that at the first glance you could see from his face that nothing was left but a fierce lust of physical gratification, sensuality, gluttony. I am convinced that Koronev, that was the brigand's name, would have been in a panic and trembling with fear before a flogging, although he could cut a man's throat without turning a hair. Orlov was a complete contrast to him. His was unmistakably the case of a triumph over the flesh. It was evident that the man's power of control was unlimited, that he despised every sort of punishment and torture, and was afraid of nothing in the world. We saw in him nothing but unbounded energy, a thirst for action, a thirst for vengeance, an eagerness to attain the object he had set before him. Among other things, I was struck by his strange haughtiness. He looked down on everything with incredible disdain, though he made no sort of effort to maintain this lofty attitude. It was somehow natural. I imagine there was no creature in the world who could have worked upon him simply by authority. He looked upon everything with surprising calmness, as though there were nothing in the universe that could astonish him, and though he quite saw that the other convicts looked on him with respect, he did not pose to them in the least. Yet vanity and self-assertion are characteristic of almost all convicts without exception. He was very intelligent and somehow strangely open, though by no means talkative. To my questions he answered frankly that he was only waiting to recover in order to get through the remainder of his punishment as quickly as possible, that he had been afraid beforehand that he would not survive it. "But now," he added, winking at me, "it's as good as over. I shall walk through the remainder of the blows and set off at once with the party to Nerchinsk. And on the way I'll escape. I shall certainly escape. If only my back would make haste and heal." And all those 5 days he was eagerly awaiting the moment when he could be discharged, and in the meantime was often laughing and merry. I tried to talk to him of his adventures. He frowned a little at such questions, but always answered openly. When he realized that I was trying to get at his conscience and to discover some sign of penitence in him, he glanced at me with great contempt and haughtiness, as though I had suddenly in his eyes become a foolish little boy, with whom it was impossible to discuss things as you would with a grown-up person. There was even a sort of pity for me to be seen in his face. A minute later he burst out laughing at me, a perfectly open-hearted laugh, free from any hint of irony, and I am sure that, recalling my words when he was alone, he laughed again to himself, many times over perhaps. At last he got his discharge from hospital with his back hardly healed. I was discharged at the same time, and it happened that we came out of the hospital together, I going to the prison and he to the guard-house near the prison where he had been detained before. As he said goodbye, he shook hands with me, and that was a sign of great confidence on his part. I believe he did it because he was much pleased with himself and glad that the moment had come. He could not really help despising me, and must have looked upon me as a weak, pitiful, submissive creature, inferior to him in every respect. Next day he was let out for the second half of his punishment. When our prison room was shut, it suddenly assumed a special aspect, the aspect of a real dwelling place, of a home. It was only now that I could see the prisoners, my comrades, quite at home. In the daytime, the sergeants, the guards, and officials in general could make their appearance at any moment in the prison, and so all the inmates behaved somewhat differently, as though they were not quite at ease, as though they were continually expecting something with some anxiety. But as soon as the room was shut up, they all quietly settled down in their places, and almost every one of them took up some handicraft. The room was suddenly lighted up. Everyone had his candle and his candlestick, generally made of wood. One worked at a boot, another sewed some garment. The foul atmosphere of the room grew worse from hour to hour. A group of festive souls squatted on their heels round a rug in a corner to a game of cards. In almost every prison room there was a convict who kept a threadbare rug a yard wide, a candle, and an incredibly dirty, greasy pack of cards. And all this together was called the Maidan. The owner of these articles let them to the players for 15 kopecks a night. That was his trade. The players usually played three leaves, hillock, and such games. They always played for money. Each player heaped a pile of copper coins before him, all he had in his pocket, and only got up when he had lost every farthing or stripped his companions. The game went on till late in the night, sometimes lasting till daybreak, till the moment when the door was opened. In our room, as in all the other rooms of the prison, there were always a certain number of destitute convicts, who had lost all their money at cards or on vodka, or who were simply beggars by nature. I say by nature, and I lay special stress on this expression. Indeed, everywhere in Russia, in all surroundings and under all conditions, there always are and will be certain strange individuals, humble and not infrequently by no means lazy, whose destiny is to be destitute forever. They are always without family ties and always slovenly. They always look cowed and depressed about something, and are always at the beck and call of someone, usually a dissipity fellow or one who has suddenly grown rich and risen. And position of respect or anything calling for initiative is a burden and affliction to them. It seems as though they had been born on the understanding that they should begin nothing of themselves and only wait on others, that they should do not what they like, should dance while others pipe. Their vocation is only to carry out the will of others. And what is more, no circumstance, no change of luck can enrich them. They are always beggars. I have noticed that such individuals are to be found not only among the peasants, but in every class of society, in every party, in every association, and on the staff of every magazine. It is the same in every room, in every prison, and as soon as a game of cards is got up, such a beggar always turns up to wait on the party. And indeed, no card party can get on without an attendant. He was usually hired by all the players in common for 5 kopecks the night, and his chief duty was to stand all night in the passage in the dark, in 30 degrees of frost, listening to every knock, every clang, every step in the yard. But sometimes the major or the officers on duty visited the prison rather late at night, came in quietly and discovered the men at play and at work and the extra candles, which could indeed be seen from the yard. Anyway, when the key was grating in the lock of the door that led from the passage to the yard, it was too late to hide what they were doing, put out the lights, and go to bed. But as the attendant on duty caught it severely from the card players afterwards, cases of such neglect were extremely rare. 5 kopecks, of course, is a ridiculously small sum even for prison, but I was always struck in prison by the harshness and mercilessness of employers, in this and also in other cases. "You've had your money, so do your work," was an argument that would bear no objection. For the trifle he had paid, the employer would take all he could take, if he could, more than was his due, and he considered that he was conferring a favor on the other into the bargain. The convict who is drunk and making merry, flinging his money right and left, always beats down his attendant, and I have noticed it not only in one prison, not only in one group of players. I have mentioned already that almost all in the room had settled down to some sort of work. Except the card players, there were not more than 5 people quite idle. They immediately went to bed. My place on the bed was next to the door. On the other side of the bed, his head nearly touching mine, lay Akim Akimych. Till 10 or 11 he worked, making some sort of colored Chinese lantern, which had been ordered in the town for a fairly good price. He made lanterns in a masterly way and worked methodically without stopping. When he had finished his work, he put it away tidily, spread out his little mattress, said his prayers, and conscientiously went to bed. Conscientiousness and orderliness he carried apparently to the point of trivial pedantry. Evidently he must have considered himself an exceedingly clever person, as is usually the case with limited and dull-witted people. I did not like him from the first day, though I remember I thought a great deal about him that first day, and what surprised me most was that such a man should have got into the prison instead of making his way in the world. Later on I shall have to speak more than once of Akim Akimych. But I will briefly describe all the inmates of our room. I had many years to spend in it, and these were all my future comrades and associates. It may well be understood that I looked at them with eager curiosity. Next to me on the left were a group of mountaineers from the Caucasus who had been sent here to various terms of imprisonment, chiefly for robbery. There were 2 Lezgis, 1 Chechenian, and 3 Dagestan Tatars. The Chechenian was a gloomy and morose person. He hardly spoke to anyone, and was always looking about him from under his brows with hatred and a venomous, malignantly sneering smile. One of the Lezgis was an old man with a long, thin, hooked nose, a regular brigand in appearance. But the second, Nura, made upon me from the first day a most charming and delightful impression. He was a man still young, of medium height, of Herculean build, with the face of a Finnish woman, quite flaxen hair, light blue eyes, and a snub nose. He had bandy legs from having spent all his previous life on horseback. His whole body was covered with scars, bayonet and bullet wounds. In the Caucasus he had belonged to an allied tribe, but was always riding over on the sly to the hostile mountaineers and making raids with them on the Russians. Everyone in prison liked him. He was always good-humored and cordial to everyone. He worked without grumbling and was calm and serene, though he often looked with anger at the filth and loathsomeness of prison life, and was furiously indignant at all the thieving, cheating, and drunkenness, in fact at everything that was dishonest. But he never picked a quarrel. He merely turned away with indignation. He had never, during his prison life, stolen anything himself or been guilty of any bad action. He was exceedingly devout. He religiously repeated his prayers. During the fasts before the Mohammedan holy days, he fasted fanatically and spent whole nights over his prayers. Everyone liked him and believed in his honesty. "Nura's a lion," the convicts used to say, and the name lion had stuck to him. He was firmly persuaded that on the expiration of his sentence he would be sent home to the Caucasus, and only lived on the hope of it. I believe he would have died if he had been deprived of it. I got a vivid impression of him on my first day in prison. It was impossible to overlook his good, sympathetic face among the surly, ill-humored, and sneering faces of the other convicts. Within my first half-hour in the prison, he slapped me on the shoulder as he passed by me, and laughed good-naturedly in my face. I could not make out at first what this meant. He spoke Russian very badly. Soon afterwards he came up to me again, and smiling gave me another friendly pat on the shoulder. He did it again and again, and so it went on for 3 days. It meant, as I guessed and found out later, that he was sorry for me, that he felt how hard it was for me to get used to prison, that he wanted to show his good will to me, to cheer me up and assure me of his protection. Kind, simple-hearted Nura. The Dagestan Tatars were 3 in number, and they were all brothers. 2 of them were middle-aged men, but the third, Ale, was not more than 22 and looked even younger. His place on the bed was next to me. His handsome, open, intelligent, and at the same time good-naturedly simple face won my heart from the first minute. I was so thankful that fate had sent me him as a neighbor rather than any other. His whole soul was apparent in his handsome, one might even say beautiful, face. His smile was so confiding, so childishly trustful. His big black eyes were so soft, so caressing, that I always found a particular pleasure in looking at him, even a consolation in my misery and depression. I am not exaggerating. When he was in his native place, one of his elder brothers, he had 5 of them, 2 of the others had been sent to some sort of penal factory, ordered him to take his saber, to get on his horse and to go with them on some sort of expedition. The respect due to an elder brother is so great among the mountaineers that the boy did not dare ask, did not even dream of asking, where they were going, and the others did not think it necessary to inform him. They were going out on a pillaging expedition to waylay and rob a rich Armenian merchant on the road. And so indeed they did. They killed the escort, murdered the Armenian, and carried off his goods. But the affair was discovered. All the 6 were caught, tried, convicted, punished, and sent to penal servitude in Siberia. The only mercy shown by the court to Ale was that he received a shorter sentence. He had been sent to Siberia for 4 years. His brothers were very fond of him, and their affection was more like a father's than a brother's. He was their comfort in exile, and sullen and gloomy as they usually were, they always smiled when they looked at him, and when they spoke to him, though they spoke to him very little, as though they still thought of him as a boy with whom it was useless to talk of serious things, their surly faces relaxed, and I guessed that they spoke to him of something humorous, almost childish. At least they always looked at one another and smiled good-humoredly after listening to his answer. He hardly dared to address them, so deep was his respect for them. It was hard to imagine how this boy was able during his prison life to preserve such a gentle heart, to develop such strict honesty, such warm feelings and charming manners, and to escape growing coarse and depraved. But his was a strong and steadfast nature in spite of all its apparent softness. As time went on, I got to know him well. He was pure as a chaste girl, and any ugly, cynical, dirty, unjust, or violent action in the prison brought a glow of indignation into his beautiful eyes, making them still more beautiful. But he avoided all strife and wrangling, though he was not one of those men who allow themselves to be insulted with impunity and knew how to stand up for himself. But he never had quarrels with anyone. Everyone liked him and was friendly to him. At first he was simply courteous to me. By degrees I began talking to him. In a few months he had learned to speak Russian very well, which his brothers never succeeded in doing all the time they were in Siberia. He seemed to me a boy of marked intelligence and peculiar modesty and delicacy, who had in fact reflected a good deal. I may as well say at once that I consider Ale far from being an ordinary person, and I look back upon my meeting with him as one of the happiest meetings in my life. There are natures so innately good, so richly endowed by God, that the very idea of their ever deteriorating seems impossible. One is always at ease about them. I am at ease about Ale to this day. Where is he now? One night, when I had been some time in prison, I was lying on the bed musing. Ale, always occupied and industrious, happened to be doing nothing at the moment, though it was early to go to bed. But it was their Mussulman holiday, and they were not working. He was lying down with his hands clasped behind his head, pondering on something, too. All at once he asked me, "Are you very sad just now?" I looked at him with curiosity, and it seemed strange to me to hear this rapid, direct question from Ale, always so delicate, so considerate, so full of the wisdom of the heart. But looking more intently, I saw in his face such sadness, such distress at some memory, that I felt at once that his own heart was heavy at that moment, and I told him so. He sighed and smiled mournfully. I loved his smile, which was always warm and tender. Besides, when he smiled, he showed 2 rows of pearly teeth, which the greatest beauty in the world might have envied. "Ah, Ale, no doubt you are thinking how they are keeping this holiday at home in Dagestan. It must be nice there." "Yes," he answered enthusiastically, and his eyes shone. "But how do you know I am thinking about it?" "How can I help knowing? It's better there than here, isn't it?" "Oh, why do you say that?" "What flowers there must be there now! What a paradise!" "Oh, better not talk of it." She was deeply stirred. "Listen, Ale, had you a sister?" "Yes, but why?" "She must be a beauty if she is like you." "Like me? She is such a beauty, there is no one in Dagestan handsomer. Ah, she is a beauty, my sister. You've never seen anyone like her. My mother was beautiful, too." "Was your mother fond of you?" "Ah, what are you saying? She must have died of grieving over me by now. I was her favorite son. She loved me more than my sister, more than anyone. She came to me in my dreams last night and cried over me." He sank into silence and said nothing more that evening. But from that time forward he sought every opportunity to talk to me, though the respect which he had for some reason felt for me always prevented him from speaking first. But he was greatly delighted whenever I addressed him. I questioned him about the Caucasus, about his former life. His brothers did not hinder his talking to me. In fact, they seemed to like it. Seeing that I was getting fonder and fonder of Ale, they, too, became much more cordial to me. Ale helped me at work, did his utmost to be of service to me in the prison, and I could see that he was delighted when he could do anything to please me or make my life easier. And in his efforts to please me, there was not a trace of anything cringing or self-seeking. Nothing but a warm, friendly feeling for me, which he no longer concealed. He had, moreover, a good deal of mechanical ability. He learnt to make underclothes fairly well, and to make boots, and later on, as far as he could, to do carpentering. His brothers praised him and were proud of him. "Listen, Ale," I said to him one day. "Why don't you learn to read and write Russian? It would be a great advantage to you in Siberia later on, you know." "I should like to very much. But of whom can I learn?" "Lots of men here can read and write. But if you like, I'll teach you." "Oh, please do." And he positively sat up on the bed and clasped his hands, looking at me imploringly. We set to work the next evening. I had the Russian translation of the New Testament, a book not prohibited in prison. With this book alone and no alphabet, Ale learnt in a few weeks to read excellently. In 3 months he had completely mastered the language of the book. He learnt eagerly, with enthusiasm. One day we read together the whole of the Sermon on the Mount. I noticed that he seemed to read parts of it aloud with special feeling. I asked him if he liked what he had read. He glanced at me quickly, and the color came into his face. "Oh, yes," he answered. "Yes, Jesus is a holy prophet. Jesus speaks God's words. How good it is!" "What do you like best of all?" "Where he says, 'Forgive, love, don't hurt others, love even your enemies.' Ah, how well he speaks!" He turned to his brothers who were listening to our conversation and began warmly saying something to them. They talked earnestly for a long time together and nodded their heads approvingly. Then, with a dignified and gracious, that is, a typically Mussulman smile, which I love so much and love especially for its dignity, they turned to me and repeated that Jesus was a prophet of God, and that he worked great marvels, that he had made a bird out of clay, had breathed on it, and it had flown away, and that was written in their books. They were convinced that in saying this they were giving me great pleasure by praising Jesus, and Ale was perfectly happy that his brothers had deigned and desired to give me this pleasure. The writing lessons, too, were very successful. Ale procured paper — he would not let me buy it with my money — pens and ink, and in about 2 months he had learnt to write an excellent hand. This actually impressed his brothers. Their pride and satisfaction knew no bounds. They did not know how to show their gratitude to me. If they happened to be working near me, they were continually helping me, and looked on it as a happiness to be able to. I need hardly say the name of Ale. He loved me perhaps as much as he loved his brothers. I shall never forget how he left prison. He drew me away behind the prison, flung himself on my neck, and cried. He had never before kissed me or shed tears. "You've done so much for me, he said, "that my father and my mother could not have done more. You have made a man of me. God will repay you, and I shall never forget you." Where is he now, my good, dear, dear Ale? Besides the Circassians, there was a group of Poles in our room, and they made a family apart and had hardly anything to do with the other convicts. I have mentioned already that their exclusiveness and their hatred of the Russian prisoners made them hated by everyone. There were 6 of them. They were men broken and made morbid by suffering. Some of them were educated men. I will speak of them more fully afterwards. During my later years in prison, I used sometimes to get books from them. The first book I read made a great, strange, and peculiar impression upon me. I will speak of these impressions more particularly later. They were most interesting to me, and I am sure that to many people they would be utterly unintelligible. Some things one cannot judge without experience. One thing I can say, that moral privation is harder to bear than any physical agonies. When a peasant goes to prison, he finds there the company of his equals, perhaps even of his superiors. He has lost a great deal, of course. Home, family, everything, but his environment is the same. The educated man condemned to the same punishment often loses infinitely more. He must overcome all his cravings, all his habits, live under conditions that are insufficient for him, must learn to breathe a different air. He is a fish out of water. And often a punishment supposed to be equal in law is 10 times as cruel for him. This is the truth, even if we consider only the material habits which have to be sacrificed. But the Poles formed a group apart. There were 6 of them, and they kept together. The only other person they liked in our room was a Jew, and him they liked perhaps simply because he amused them. He was liked indeed by the other convicts too, though every one without exception laughed at him. He was the only Jew among us, and I can't think of him even now without laughing. Every time I looked at him, I could not help recalling Gogol's Jew, Yankel, in Taras Bulba, who, when he undressed at night and prepared to get into the cupboard where he slept with his wife, looked exactly like a chicken. I.IV, our Jew, was the very image of a plucked chicken. He was a man about 50, short and weakly built, cunning and at the same time decidedly stupid. He was impudent and conceited, and at the same time awfully cowardly. He was covered all over with wrinkles, and on his forehead and each cheek bore the marks of having been branded on the scaffold. I could never understand how he had survived 60 lashes. He had been sent here charged with murder. He had hidden away a receipt which his friends had procured from a doctor immediately after his punishment. It was the receipt for an ointment supposed to remove all traces of branding in a fortnight. He dare not make use of this ointment in the prison, and was awaiting the end of his 12 years' term of imprisonment, after which he fully intended to take advantage of the receipt when he could live as a settler. "Else I shall never be able to get married," he said to me once, "and I certainly want to be married." We were great friends. He was always in excellent spirits. He had not a bad time in prison. He was a jeweler by trade, always had more than enough work from the town, in which there was no jeweler, and so escaped hard labor. Of course he was a pawnbroker at the same time, and supplied the whole prison with money at a percentage and on security. He had come to the prison before me, and one of the Poles gave me a minute description of his arrival. It is a most amusing story which I will tell later on. I shall speak of I.IV more than once again. Among the other prisoners in our room were 4 old believers, elderly men and great Bible readers, one of whom was the old fellow from the Starodubovsky settlement. Then there were 2 or 3 little Russians, gloomy fellows. A young convict of 23 with a lean little face and a sharp little nose, who had already committed 8 murders. A group of false coiners, one of whom kept all the room amused. And finally several gloomy and sullen individuals, shaven and hideous, taciturn and envious, who looked with hatred about them and meant to look like that, to scowl, to be silent and full of hatred for long years to come, the whole term of their imprisonment. Of all this I had only a glimpse on that first desolate evening of my new life, a glimpse in the midst of smoke and filth, of oaths and indescribable obscenity, of foul air, of clanking fetters, of curses and shameless laughter. I lay down on the bare boards of the bed, and putting my clothes under my head, I had not a pillow yet, covered myself with my sheepskin. But for a long while I could not get to sleep, though I was utterly worn out and shattered by all the monstrous, unexpected impressions of that first day. But my new life was only just beginning. There was much awaiting me in the future of which I had never dreamed, of which I had no foreboding. Breaking in. The Lezgis, the Chechenian, and the Dagestan Tatars are all treated here as representatives of the broader Circassian group from the Caucasus that Akim Akimych mentioned 2 chapters earlier. We should expect that most of them would be practicing Muslims, or Mussulmen, as it is put here, and so Ale's reaction to the New Testament is noteworthy. The story of Jesus giving life to clay birds does indeed appear in the Quran, as well as in a non-canonical Christian source, The Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Taras Bulba is an early novella by Nikolai Gogol, and his fictional character Yankel is a walking collection of anti-Semitic stereotypes. Since Isai Fomich apparently really did exemplify some of these stereotypes, it is a bit harder to accuse Dostoevsky of anti-Semitism, although perhaps modern readers will shift uncomfortably at his depiction, both here and in later passages. When our narrator mentions Little Russians, he is not talking about Russians of small stature. He is referring to people from the region we now call Ukraine. This expression will pop up again in later pages. The Polish prisoners are of thematic importance, and we will come back to them later. We won't hear much more of the bandit Orlov, although his interaction with our narrator is of particular interest, and I'll address it in my closing remarks. End of comments.